Welcome to She Persisted, the Gen Z mental health podcast. I'm your host, Sadie Sutton. Let's get into it.
For a lot of younger people in particular, they don't see themselves as having a lot of value. So they're coming to the table feeling like, all I want to do is take, and I don't have anything to give. And so the thing that I think is important for people to know is there's value in the problems that you can help other people solve. Also that there's value in having problems that other people can help you solve too.
Hello, you guys, and welcome back to She Persisted. I'm so excited you are here. We are talking about a really interesting topic, which is workplace dynamics, inequalities, how to find mentors and sponsor your peers and have your peers be sponsors for you. This is one of the most important skills that you can have going into your future career or thriving as a student. And so I'm really excited for you guys to hear from our expert guest today, Dr. Rosalind Chow. She is an associate professor of organization behavior and theory at Carnegie Mellon. She studies the power of social hierarchy and its impact on diversity and inclusion efforts within organizations. Her new book, The Doors You Can Open, talks about the ways that we network in the workplace and really revolutionizing that process and coming at it from a really new angle. So in this episode, you're going to learn what work mentors and sponsors look like, how you can land one, and how you can be one yourself. We talk about how inequality affects workplace dynamics, advocating for others, providing value, and some other larger workplace themes that are really helpful to be aware of when navigating your career or your future career. And we're releasing this episode after I'm a couple weeks into my new job at Binghamton University. I am working as a research assistant full-time, so I feel like I'm sticking my head out from under the water to record this intro for you guys because every day has just been so insanely busy. But this conversation had given me so many skills to bring into this new role, and I really hope it does the same for you. So without keeping this too long, and of course a solo coming soon with all the updates, but let's dive into this incredible career episode. Well, thank you so much for joining me on She Persisted. I'm so excited to have you on. I think we're also recording this at a perfect time because a lot of people are just starting to transition into post-grad. Maybe they're doing summer internships, or maybe they just figured out where they're going to college. It's a very opportune moment to reflect on how we can be effective in our careers, how we can start to establish these mentor relationships, how we can support our peers through this process. And so I'm really excited to have you on the show today.
Well, thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Of course. So for people that don't know, you are a professor. You also have a book that just came out, and I would love to get a little bit of background about how you ended up in this area, studying leadership and mentorship relationships, diversity, workplace psychology, all of the things as an area that you are interested in.
Oh, well, I'll give you the short version of the story, which is I originally wanted to be a clinical psychologist. And for those who don't know, to get into a clinical psychology program, they're quite competitive. I mean, everything's competitive these days, but even back then, they were very competitive. And the way to get in would be to have research experience. And so I started volunteering at a psychology lab to do research. And then I also volunteered at a suicide hotline. And because of the volunteering, quickly realized that I didn't have what it took to work with clients, but that I actually wasn't so bad at this research thing, and that I actually kind of enjoyed it. And then I actually ended up taking a class in organizational behavior my senior year of college. I do tell this story actually in the book because what's funny about that is my father had told me about organizational behavior a long time prior to me taking that class. And because I, didn't want to listen to my parents' advice, I just totally brushed it off. And it wasn't until a friend of mine said, "Oh, I took this class in organizational behavior, it was really good." So I ended up taking that class and realized, oh, here's a way that I could do psychology, but in a context that was really applicable and interesting, because it was important to me to be working on things that would have an impact on people. So then I ended up going to organizational behavior and doing research on social inequality, how we understand social inequality. Did that for like almost 15 years, I guess, a long time, and got a little bit tired of just constantly pointing out problems and not thinking about solutions, which is how I came upon mentorship and sponsorship. Got frustrated actually with how academics are thinking about sponsorship and mentorship. And so I started doing research in this area and was very excited to put out this book because I think there's a lot about mentorship and sponsorship that people don't really understand or have what I would consider to be maybe like a more outdated perception of. And so hopefully the book is going to help illuminate these different ways that mentorship and sponsorship can happen and how we can all be mentors and sponsors.
So there's this difference between mentorship and sponsorship. You really dive into this in the book, but just like so many things in the psychology world, these terms that we like very clearly define and study in everyday life get really confused and mixed up. So to kind of set a foundation for people, can you clarify the difference between mentorship and sponsorship, especially with respect to your work?
Sure. So, I mean, I'll start off by saying with like where we were and why I got all like worked up to start studying this. So, mentorship for a long time really just referred to an older, more seasoned, experienced person who was helping a more junior person in kind of through life. It didn't even actually have to be about career. As it got picked up more in the career space, it started referring, to much more specific, like work-related behaviors.
Yeah.
And they did talk about sponsorship, but for a long time, sponsorship was kind of this like subcategory of mentorship. So it was like something that mentors would do. If you looked at what the definition of sponsorship was, it was like a mentor using their influence on your behalf. And what struck me as being, like why sponsorship was not like the other things that the mentorship people would talk about was it was acting on a different person. So that is actually the big key to how I think about that difference. It's like with mentorship, first of all, now people who study mentorship think that mentorship can come from anyone. You have peer mentorship, reverse mentorship. There's all kinds of mentorship, right? Mentorship can come from anyone. But they've always said that sponsors have to be more powerful. And we can talk about why that is. We'll certainly, I'm sure, touch on this. But mentorship is really about changing the person you're trying to support. So when you think about people who mentor you, it's like they're giving you feedback or encouragement, right? They're saying like, great job, or keep doing this, or well, as you do this again next time, maybe you should consider doing it differently in this way. But these are all things that are meant to change us as the person who's like the recipient of this advice and coaching. And sponsorship is very different in the sense that it is not about trying to change the person who's being helped. It's actually about changing other people and how they see and treat the person that the sponsor is trying to help. So going forward, I'm going to be using mentor mentee very like clearly to be like, okay, that's mentorship. But if I'm ever talking about sponsorship, I will be saying like a protege, not a mentee. Other people will use sponsee as well as a.
So mentorship relationships, the individual is changing, evolving, likely because of the knowledge that's being imparted or the feedback that's being provided. Sponsorship, you're more impacting the way you're perceived or how others are relating to you.
Yeah, so it's about who is being asked to change. Right?
Yes.
Mentees are changed, and then audiences, so external audiences, are being asked to change how they see and treat a protege.
One area that I think is really interesting here for us to consider before we dive into all the nuances is why this is important. You mentioned in your background social inequality. And so I'm curious why sponsorship and mentorship show up as such an important factor for individuals who are coming from minoritized backgrounds or don't necessarily have as much of a position of privilege, I guess you would say, in these positions.
So one way to think about why this matters is that mentorship, for the most part, is really related to how we personally experience our day-to-day lives.
Hmm.
So having a mentor makes us feel safer at work, makes us feel more satisfied with our jobs. We're happier to be there, right? We feel like we have support and close relationships. Sponsorship, because it doesn't act on the protege, one, it's possible for people to be sponsored and to not even know about it, right?
Mm.
And so
That's how we're doing this interview. As you got sponsored, I
that's
heard about
right.
your book, and it's amazing setup.
Yeah, no, that's right. So here, my sponsor was Adam Grant, apparently. And so Adam recommended that Sadie get in touch with me, right? That you get in touch with me. And so
Hmm.
that's how this happened. And hopefully, like, Adam did a good job of thinking through, okay, like, what kind of guests is Sadie like interested in? And then
Hmm.
what could Rosalind speak to? And are they a good match?
Yeah.
And to the extent that he's done a good job of matching us, it's going to be great for both of us,
Yeah.
right? But that's the thing is, like, obviously, I'm happy to hear that Adam sponsored me. But ultimately, where sponsorship becomes really important is getting people access to opportunities that they wouldn't have otherwise have gotten, right? Like, I have no idea
Yeah.
about you, and you had no idea about me, right? And so this is a connection. This being on this podcast was an opportunity that would probably never have presented itself if not for the sponsorship of Adam, right? And so when you think about who gets sponsored in organizations at work or wherever, a lot of it is predicated on who knows who, and also who's seen as being exceptional. And I assume, well, maybe I shouldn't assume, but there's a lot of research out there, right, that suggests that when it comes to being perceived as exceptional, women and racial minorities typically have a higher bar. So
Yeah.
they're much less likely to be seen as exceptional, which makes it less likely that they're going to be sponsored. So that's one part of it. But then the other part of it is also about who their sponsors are. So, gender and racial and ethnic background also play a big role in people's networks, who they know. And so that also impacts the kinds of opportunities that their sponsors can even sponsor them for.
I'm wondering if you can offer like an additional definition that fits into both the sponsoring and mentoring context, which is networking. You mentioned that like our networks impact who we sponsors, or our mentors can leverage their own networks to get us opportunities. How does networking fit into this equation of mentorship and sponsorship?
Mm-hmm. So, just one thing I want to clarify is that mentors can be sponsors. So, it's not
Mm-hmm.
like a mutually exclusive thing, right? So,
Yeah.
someone who's your mentor can also sponsor you. But it doesn't have to be that way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I would not say, like, I would not consider Adam Grant a mentor of mine. But he is certainly a sponsor of mine.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that. So, who mentors us and who sponsors us is very much dependent on our network of
Mm-hmm.
who we know, right? Because we can't build relationships with people if we don't have access to them in some way.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where networking like plays a role with both mentorship and sponsorship. The difference between mentorship and sponsorship when it comes to how we use our networks is different because what sponsors do is they essentially share their network with their sponsee, with their
Mm.
protege. So that's at least that's one way of being a sponsor is to do what we would call like strategic introductions, right? So I'm trying to think about like this example of Adam here, right? He did not strategically introduce us. He
Mm-hmm.
did tell you about me, but if he had
Mm-hmm.
wanted to go a little bit further, he would have directly put us in touch, right? And that would have
Mm-hmm.
been a stronger form of sponsorship. But him letting you know about me and saying that he thought I was a good fit is also another way of being a sponsor. But again, his ability to do that is predicated on him knowing me and you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the how much our sponsors can do for us depends a lot on their networks.
Hmm.
So you need to have a sponsor, or you don't need to, but right, it's better to have a sponsor who is well connected, because the more different their network is from yours, the more
Hmm.
opportunities they have to make these connections and to match you with other people in their network who would be like delighted to know about you.
Yeah. So building on that, keeping in mind that like a network that aligns with your goals, a substantial network that could potentially be utilized is a good thing to be looking for. What other things are you aware of when identifying potential mentors and sponsors? Whether it's like types, like how they make these connections, are they hands on, are they hands off, what stage of the career they're in? Like, what would you be looking for and avoiding in that mentorship and sponsorship context?
So that's a really great question. One caveat I will say is that because sponsorship is it's like it's based on whether or not the sponsor wants to sponsor you. And so
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's hard for me to answer these questions because it kind of assumes that proteges have some sort of agency in this, which they do,
Yeah.
but maybe not to the degree that I feel like people seem to think that they do.
Mm-hmm.
And I am only emphasizing this because I feel like it just puts so much pressure on young people in particular to be like, okay, now I have to go and find a mentor and I have to go and find a sponsor. How do I go and do that? How do I pick the right person? And so one thing that I think is really important to say is like, actually, you don't get to pick.
Yeah. Yeah.
you you can make it really easy for other people to pick you. But you don't necessarily get to pick. But so if I could just reframe that as like, how do I make it easy for people to want to mentor me or want
Mm-hmm.
to sponsor me? Obviously, right, table stakes is just like do a good job at whatever it is that you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
But that's like a necessary but insufficient condition, right? For getting for sponsorship in particular. As remember, sponsorship is given to people we think who are exceptional, not just
Yeah.
average. So the way to get over the hump, if you're already like a really strong worker or performer, is you have to make it personal. So
Mm-hmm.
this is where things can sometimes get a little bit trickier, especially for women and people of color. This is where you have these conversations about like, you should bring your whole self to work, you should be more authentic at work. All of that is based on research that suggests that, like, being more forthcoming, humanizing yourself is a way to build relationships with other people. Building those closer relationships is really what often leads to sponsorship from sponsors. But then when you're a woman, you're kind of like, well, how much do I want to really reveal? Or, just any sort of, if you marginalized person from a marginalized background, you're kind of like, how real do I want to get about my like day-to-day life experience with this person, especially if they're from a group that's different than mine. And so it becomes this interesting balancing act for people of like how much to share versus how much to withhold. Ultimately, the thing that I think is important is if you just show people what you care about. So it doesn't have to be about sports or, I mean, those are the easy things typically.
Yeah.
But if there's something that you're really, really passionate about, I think it's okay to make that part known, especially if you put it in a broad enough way that it's kind of like, why would anybody ever think that this was not a good thing for people to be passionate about?
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, all of us care about, well, I can't say all of us maybe, but like, I would say that most people think it's a good thing to want to contribute positively to the world, whatever that might look like. And, you might say, for instance, like, I'm super passionate about addressing climate change. Well, that can be a little political
Mm-hmm.
in some circles, right? So instead, you can broaden it to be like, I really care about like future generations. and making sure that the younger generations are going to have as great of opportunities or, environments as generations who have come before. So just kind of tweaking things that might come off as being a little more political, casting them in a broader way, but making it easy for people to see what you're passionate about. So passion here is really important because people assume, usually accurately, that when we're working on things that we're passionate about, we're going to be willing to like really go for it, right? We'll be
Yeah.
super motivated, we'll be really persistent in our willingness to work for it. So we'll put in high effort, high intensity effort. And this is all stuff that people typically think of as leading to high performance.
Mm.
And so if people see you as passionate and they understand what your core value is or are, and assuming that they have core values that align with yours, that's how you're actually going to hook them in, right? So I wouldn't go out looking for mentors and sponsors in this like hyper instrumental way of like, this person is in a position of power and they're going to be able to like get me X, Y, and Z. It's more like, okay, these are my values. What are their values? Do they align with mine? Do we
Hmm.
care about the same things? And assuming everything aligns, then it just becomes so much easier to build that relationship with them.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on like I don't know if it's an age-old adage, but it's advice I've heard a lot with relation to, I guess, more the mentorship framework, which is like you provide value and then they'll provide value in return rather than just going and being like, what can I get from this person or context? Would
Hmm.
you say that applies and it's true where you focus first on how you can provide value or information or support to the other person, and then in turn you might receive mentorship or sponsorship?
Yeah, so I agree with that sentiment. The reason why I don't like wholeheartedly subscribe to it is because when we start talking about, like, okay, for this to work out, I have to be able to provide value to the other person. So now I have to start thinking, like, well, what value do I bring to this relationship? And for a lot of younger people in particular, like, they don't see themselves as having a lot of value to
Yeah.
bring. They feel very powerless. So they're coming to the table feeling like all I want to do is take and I don't have anything to give.
Mm.
And that makes networking in particular like feel terrible because you're in a way like, even though we might not consciously think about it in this way, like you're kind of going out and trying to like exploit people, which is not fun.
Yeah.
And so the thing that I think is important for people to know is like, there's value in terms of what you personally can do, but there's also value in who you know and the problems that you can help other people solve. And
Mm.
also that there's value in having problems that other people can help you solve too.
Yeah.
So just like a flip, right? Is like this thing of, okay, I want to help other people with their problems, when in reality, like, people love solving problems,
Yeah.
and so if you can give them a problem to solve, that's actually another way to build a relationship, because for them, well, now they've actually just seen themselves helping you and they're like, okay, well, I just helped this person. I must be the kind of person who helps, like I must like them,
Hmm.
right? And then like that's actually a perfectly valid other way of building relationships, is not necessarily providing value to the other person, but providing value in a different way, which is
Yeah.
helping them feel good about themselves by having a problem that they can help you solve.
You mentioned how we can set ourselves up to be effectively sponsored. How can we ourselves be good sponsors, especially to peers, classmates, beyond, like you mentioned, like potentially there's the network where you can connect people. But what are these ways that we can effectively sponsor people, whether it's like how we approach the relationship, how we advocate for someone? Do you focus on like external outputs or more personality traits? Like, what are the best practices there?
I think the easiest way to sponsor, especially when you're at a junior level and you don't have a lot of power per
Mm-hmm.
se, right, is just to pay attention to what is going on with other people and making note of what makes them special. And then when there is an opportunity where their area of like specialness is needed, that's your opportunity to like sing their praises and be like, here is this person that you all should know about because they're going to be the solution to this problem that you're trying to solve. And so
Mm-hmm.
you get credit for that because you've brought the solution to them, right? You're
Yeah.
not the solution, but you've helped solve the problem. And so this is this goes back to your earlier question of like, how can we provide value? We can provide value by being the solution ourselves, or we can also provide value by putting other people in touch with solutions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, when I think about like junior people, or even I'll just use you as an example, maybe inaccurately. You should let me know, right? But I can tell you on my end that people who are in my generation are like, I don't know how to get through to the millennials. I have no connection with the younger generation, but I would love to be engaged with them,
Yeah.
right? But because our networks are typically limited to people who are similar to our own, it makes it really hard
Mm-hmm.
to actually like find and build a relationship with someone who's like significantly younger. But I
Yeah.
can tell you that, for instance, like other podcasters that I've been speaking with are like, how do I get in touch with a millennial audience? How do I get on millennial podcasts? Like,
Mm-hmm.
how do I build this network with this group that I don't have insight or access to?
Yeah.
And that's where people like you, right,
Mm-hmm.
could become really, really important because you are open, presumably, to having those relationships and can then make those matches for people
Yeah.
in your social sphere and then, these other people who otherwise don't have access.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And it's something that Gen Z very much overlooks, which is like there's a lot of people that want to understand how we think and feel and approach issues. They and that is like a lot of value that can be provided, whether it's like network or insight on experiences. I think especially in industry, like there's a lot of sentiment of like how can we reach Gen Z? How can we understand how they're thinking? And as a Gen Z or as a millennial, you are qualified to speak to your experience. And so I think you've kind of like alluded to this, that we do undervalue what the value we can potentially provide is. And so being aware and hearing those opportunities. And I mean, maybe again, you can refer to someone else. You could say, I might not be the best person to speak to this, but really like hyping yourself up a bit and thinking about those more creative ways that you could provide perspective or insight or value, I think is something we overlook, but can make those initial relationships really effective.
Yeah, totally. Yes. Like plus one to all of that.
Yeah. And I would definitely say that like I try to be like more creative and out of the box when structuring these mentorship relationships, especially in academia, because there's a lot of inbound requests of the same thing. Like, I can help with research. I want to take this class. Like, I'd love support. And I've been able to effectively break in by being like, do you need help with social media? Or I have perspective on this area of digital related things, or you need more participants, I can make IRB approved video edits. Like these skills, this value that's provided that isn't like the traditional trajectory or framework, but still might benefit that other person.
Oh yeah. Okay. I would love to get one of those emails from you, Sadie.
Right? Like it's a need, like, and we are so savvy as Gen Z and media and how we can like improve dissemination in academia and kind of make these things more widely accessible. But no one in Gen Z is thinking from that perspective of like, how can I help in that respect? Like that's a skill set that I can absolutely provide to someone. And no one is ever like, hello, nice to meet you. Do you need help with this? Which is so interesting.
Yeah. But then, I guess the thing that I would like caution people on, right, is like don't offer your help indiscriminately.
Yes. Very
Right?
true.
Because part of what you're doing is as you're building these connections, you're essentially starting to build your own reputation. And so you want to be careful about who you associate yourself with.
Hmm.
And this is again where those values become really important in the same way that you making your values more transparent makes it easier for other people to want to sponsor you. You clearly, if you are going out and looking for sponsors or mentors, like trying your best to find people who have values that align with yours
Yes.
so that you don't run into any issues like later on.
100%. Absolutely. Switching gears a little bit and going back to the social inequality piece, you've done really interesting research that shows that when we focus on disadvantage versus privilege, people respond really differently. And so, like, the way that we present these issues, the way we frame these conversations has a lot of implications. What are the best practices for discussing disparities, being effective, framing inequality based on what we know from a psychological standpoint?
So it's funny that you asked me this question because only recently has a review piece come out that looks at this question, I guess, of like best practices. I can tell you that their recommendation is not to not frame, which is to say, like, there's a difference in how much men and women make.
Hmm.
So that would be saying, like, there's an inequality, but I'm not going to tell you what the nature of that inequality is, right?
Yeah.
Because what people are trying to avoid when they do that is say either that men are making more than women or women are making less than men, which, as you alluded to, we found in our research actually has a lot of ramifications for how people understand what's happening in those situations. So,
Hmm.
mostly being that, like, when we say that one group makes more or is better off, we assume that they're the group that needs to be explained.
Hmm.
They're the ones that are like deviant in a
Hmm.
way, right? But when we say that other groups are worse off or make less, suddenly they're the group that needs to be explained.
Hmm.
So, my general take is that to the best of your ability, try and do it both ways,
Hmm.
right? So, try to be balanced in how you express or describe inequality. So, sometimes using advantage, sometimes using disadvantage. That's if you're trying to be even handed about it.
Hmm.
If you have a strong belief about what the nature of the inequality is, then like use the term that you think is appropriate, right? So if you think that the deficiency, right, that the group that needs to be fixed are women,
Hmm.
then you can say that women are disadvantaged, that they earn less or whatever. And this is probably how we got into this world of like lean in and
Yeah.
it's all this programming about like, okay, how do we fix women? How do we get women to change so that they can have better outcomes? You don't see this same kind of rhetoric in terms of like men, right? When in reality, if women are making less, like kind of objectively speaking, somebody else has to be making more.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we don't
Absolutely.
typically talk about it in that way. And potentially, like, part of the reason we don't talk about it that way is because we don't see men as the problem, which is
Hmm.
why we don't have programming that is like, okay, I mean, how do we, like men, how do we get you to be less overconfident? That
Yeah.
would be potentially like one thing that we could try and solve there. But
Hmm. So I'm curious, and we touched on this briefly when we connected before the interview about how we get into these conversations and there's pushback or changes and occur because it kind of feels like a zero sum game, right? Like if you apply resources to one place, it's being taken from someone else, or people struggle to like respond and make change, even if objectively they're like, that's not fair or that's not right. Do you have any like research or information on why people have like such strong responses to these contexts, why we do view these things like peers getting promoted or who has a mentor as a reflection of our own opportunities and in that like zero sum game framework?
oh my gosh. I mean, so that's like that's a big question.
Yes.
Ultimately, one is that like everybody wants to feel like they deserve what they have.
Hmm.
And they want to feel like there's a pretty straight line between things that they do and like what happens to them.
Hmm.
Because if there's not like a clear link between the effort we put in or like how well we do and what we get, like
Like, why do we do it?
what?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like not a recipe for knowing how to navigate life because you're just like,
Yeah.
well, everything's random. So I think we're innately kind of motivated to want to see these linkages and also to see ourselves as deserving, right,
Yeah.
of what we have. So that's one part of it. I guess underneath what you're trying to say is like, why is our mentality towards so much of life right now so zero sum?
Yeah.
Like, why can't we be more expansive in how we think about like what is possible? Again, so there's so much that we could go into, but I ultimately I do think it has to do with the fact that we as a society have defined success to look a certain way. And that certain way that we've kind of all landed upon kind of is zero sum. Like
Yeah.
there's only so far you can climb in an organizational hierarchy. Now, that's not to say that like you can't create more wealth for everyone. Like that
Hmm.
is actually a possibility. The issue is that even once you generate, let's say like you generate more wealth for everyone, you're still going to have people who want differentiation between those who are better and those who are worse. Like
Hmm.
hierarchy is something that we are naturally wired to look for and in a way like want because
Hmm.
it makes the world easier for us to navigate. I'm thinking in the back of my mind, like Ezra Klein has this great book called Abundance right
Hmm.
now, where his whole argument, in a way, is like trying to diagnose some of these structural reasons why we've gotten into this kind of zero sum mentality.
Yeah.
Michael Sandel has a book called The Tyranny of Merit that is also a really great resource for thinking about like why are we all
Like, why does it exist like this? Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So how about I punt on that and say that there are other people who have like
Yes.
much
No, I
more well
love it.
thought out answers to this
Yes.
question.
No, I definitely will be ordering both of those because I do think, like you said, this permeates so many areas of our society. And so understanding how we got into this position, in some respects, it makes sense how we've ended up here, even if it's hugely ineffective or inefficient. You did touch on part of my question, which is like hierarchies that exist in organizations. We have these larger structures that we operate within, but it's hard to create change in these large structures. And it's hard to shift these inequalities or disparities or disadvantages that exist. I'm curious why that is, even if we have these objective pieces of data that can tell us these things are inefficient or not equal or that something should change. Why is it so hard for that to occur?
Oh, I mean, those who are in positions of power are always going to be wanting the status quo, right?
Yeah.
Like nobody actively, or not nobody, right? But very few people actively are like, see how great I have it? I'm going to give that away so that
Yeah.
you can have it too. In my more cynical moments, I would say the reason it's so hard is purely because of that, right? It's like
Yeah.
people are going to want what's good for them.
Hmm.
And people who are higher in the power hierarchy, who have more control over how things are run,
Yeah.
are going to have a hard time imagining a process where they have to give up that power or change their process in a way that calls into question whether or not they should have succeeded,
Hmm.
right? So if
Yeah.
I'm going to argue for different standards of evaluation because I feel like the old ones were not meritocratic, like what does that say about all the people who succeeded under that
Yeah.
original process? right? That's like not a message that is going to go over really well.
Yeah.
I think it is the rare place where you're going to have leadership that is sufficiently, you need to have really strong leadership to enact some of these changes. And unfortunately, and leadership tenures are getting shorter. So, meaning like if you look at the average CEO tenure, it's decreasing over time to somewhere around, I think it's like 4 years now. Think about it. That's like how much time you spent in undergrad.
Yeah.
Like how much change, and think about like the things that you cared about in undergrad, and maybe like if you were in student government, you were trying to change.
Yeah. No,
That
our student government is like getting us these sweatshirts. That's like one of the main goals for that tenure.
Right, because you're just kind of like my ability, because I'm not going to be sticking around long enough to see these implementations through.
Yeah.
And so one option is don't bother. The second is like scale down the ambition of the goal, I guess, right? And the other one obviously is like try and do it. But if you're going to try and do it, you have to know that everything is lined up in such a way that you can actually make enough change in the time that you're going to be around that it's going to be sticky. And that part is the harder part.
Yeah. And I think like there's a lot, this is a very interesting school of thought, especially with respect to the political system and just swinging back and forth. And it's like, okay, changes are made and then they're reversed. And like all of these dynamics and exactly what you're describing, which is why psychologically it's almost like discouraged to make these changes because you're not invested in the outcome. But then also when these people are in positions of power, it's like goes against our basic instincts to like rework the system,
Right.
even if initially that was a goal.
Yeah.
I am curious to wrap things up. If you were starting your career out and you wanted to set yourself up for success, whether it's a way of thinking about this process, having a certain goal, whether it's presenting yourself for sponsors or mentorships, looking for people that are aligned with values. You mentioned little things in your book as being really important. Like, what would your one piece of advice be to someone who's at the early stages and, again, maybe is undervaluing themselves, doesn't feel like they have that power to make these huge shifts, and maybe they're listening to this and like, okay, that might be harder than I originally thought, but what would your insight be there?
This is a great question. And I guess my answer to that would be I wish I was more secure in myself. And I say
Yeah.
this in a very particular way. Not in the sense that I should have thought better of myself or like thought that I had so much to give or, like I should have had higher self-esteem, even though I would have loved that for myself. What I mean by that is, I think for a lot of younger people, there's this concern that, like, if somebody else does well, it must mean that I'm not doing well, or the whole, like, social comparison thing is
Yeah.
hard. It's so much better if you can go around in the world and give the gift of seeing other people for
Yeah.
who they are and telling them who they are. And what I mean by that is like, when you see someone and they seem like they are in their zone or in their element, right? Or doing something that really makes them light up, naming that for them so that they have information about who they are when they're at their best.
Yeah.
And that can be your superpower too. Like, in a way, I think that probably has become a superpower that I've developed over time, is just being able to observe other people and then being able to name what it is that makes them unique and special. And not just telling them about it, but then also going out and telling other people about it.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's like my own kind of little way of being someone's sponsor. I think if I had started off doing that, I have to imagine that I would be a really different person than
Yeah.
who I am now in like totally positive ways,
Yeah.
right? But I think this whole zero sum thing social comparison really gets in our own ways.
For
And
sure.
it's hard. I will also say, like, if someone my age now told me this when I was younger, I would have been like, yeah, easy for you to say, thanks. But yeah, if you can manage it, right? Seeing what other people's superpowers are and being able to name them to them. Because for all you know, they're going to be able to do that for you and tell you what your superpower is. And that
Yeah.
is like amazing information to have.
And I do think what you said about being really secure in yourself also really means being aware of your weaknesses. And then when you're looking for strengths in others, you are able to then leverage that network and sponsor others and be the problem solver to connect someone with that person. And I think it's a much more fulfilling path. It's less stressful than being like, I have to be perfect at everything and show no weaknesses. And it's a zero-sum game. So it's just me and everything's riding on my back. So I think that's really important to remember, especially in the early stages of your education or your career.
Yeah, definitely
Amazing.
agree.
Well, if people want to order your book or read more about your research and the work you're doing, where can they do that?
So the book is being sold wherever you get your normally get your
Yeah.
books. I am usually a big fan of bookshop.org, right, to support independent booksellers, but also like request it from your library because
Yeah.
libraries also need a lot of help right now. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm not sure if LinkedIn is a place where
If people are in college and like thinking about their careers, they're definitely for sure, unfortunately, against their will, making their
yes.
LinkedIn profiles.
I was also brought onto LinkedIn kicking and screaming, did
Yeah.
not want to do it. So I totally understand that.
I have the opinion, people are like, social media is so toxic. And I'm like, have you ever been on LinkedIn? Because that is a stressful place to be scrolling.
Yeah, so I will say, the way that I use LinkedIn is in retrospect an extension of things I talk about in the book. So I don't
Yeah.
actually write about myself on LinkedIn.
Mm-hmm.
I write all about other people's research. I
I
try
love
to
that.
amplify other people's work that I think is really cool and
Mm-hmm.
explain why I think it's cool and why people should know about it.
Yeah.
And that has made LinkedIn so much more fulfilling.
Yeah. I love that. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I'm so glad we got to do this. And I know this is going to help so many people that are struggling with how to approach these hierarchies and relationships and also how they can support their peers and their network. And so thank you so much for joining me and sharing your insight and expertise.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. And thank you, Adam, for putting us
Yes.
together.
Absolutely. If you enjoyed this episode of She Persisted, make sure to leave a review, subscribe, and share with a friend or family member. Follow along at She Persisted Podcast on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and more for bonus content. Thanks for listening and keep persisting.